Uh, Thank you for joining us. Today, my guest is Professor Donald Lessard, and I will keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes, we'll talk about Don as a person, Professor Lessard is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally, is a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I will skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Don is a fellow of the AIB. He was the past president of AIB and the dean of fellows. He received the Pathfinder Award, as well as the Best Paper Award from Engineering Projects Organization Society, the Graham and Dodd Award from Financial Analyst Journal, and the BP Global Helios Award. And Don has served as a guest editor, consulting editor, or an associate editor at Global Strategy Journal, JIPS, Energy Strategy Reviews, Journal of Applied Corporate Finance, and Journal of Finance. Thank you, Don, for joining us.
Happy to join you, and happy to talk a little bit about myself and how I came into this field of international management. You asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I tried to think back if I ever had a clear image, and I don't think I had a clear picture of myself, but being a teacher or educator, I think was always in the cards. My parents were educators, the family were educators. You also asked about when I became aware of national versus international versus local. I grew up with it. My mother had emigrated to the United States when she was 30 years old from Argentina. She had been born in Chile, but she was part of a multinational religious organization, so was very aware of that. Her father had been the first national ordained minister. Her mother had been the daughter of foreign missionaries. So this whole business of multinational organizations, I learned it at 4 years old. And in fact, I was doing consulting for Coca-Cola in the 70s in Mexico, and I went to an annual distributors conference. And I recognized the format. It was exactly the same religious format of the brethren reporting in from the mission field about how they were converting souls, except they were convincing people to drink Coca-Cola instead of water. But it was the same thing. It was the same structure. I got interested in not IB per se, but international development. I had grown up as a 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade. I'd gone to Cuba with my mother. I had watched the revolution. I saw Che Guevara mount the final battle of the revolution. These are life-changing events. And I learned how to write and speak in Spanish. So although the readers can't see me waving my hands, that's what I do. My grammatical structure still reflects that. And learning across languages and cultures was always key. I remember being introduced to the 8th grade classroom. The professor and the students spoke no English. I spoke no Spanish. I remember the door being closed. At the end of the year, I was first in the province in the high school entry tests. Wow. So that's, that I became an internationalist at that point. And after that, I followed the opportunities. In college, I fell into Latin American studies as a degree because I transferred from a small religious college to Stanford, and I found that Latin American studies was the one major I could complete within a year. And I started looking at some of the development issues in Cuba that I had seen firsthand, and Fidel Castro had gone through a disastrous round of trying to diversify the real economy away from sugar. And I started learning in business school about this marvelous new stuff of portfolio diversification. And I said, could you actually mix those two and somehow or another advance the country by using financial mechanisms to get around the very hard to do real diversification? And that was the driver of my interest in diversification, in research, in internationalization. I finished Latin American studies, and with a degree in Latin American studies, you're eligible for law school or business school because you have no disciplinary preparation for anything. And I applied to all of those, and business school offered more money. So I became a business school student. And I said, I might want to teach sometime. And they said, would you like to get a PhD? And I said, sure. And I was going to do that in development economics. And a good friend of mine who was very frank, he said, the business school is really not very good at development economics. Pay attention to where the business school is on the frontier. This was 1966. Stanford Business School and a few others were on the frontier of finance. This was brand new stuff. The capital asset pricing model was just happening, and we knew it, and the economics departments didn't know it yet. So I went into finance and I learned the tools of finance, and I started doing a dissertation on risk premia on corporate bonds, and it was boring. And I dumped it, and I went and did a dissertation on diversification across emerging markets with hand-collected data, and that's what got me into this field. I came into international management through the international finance door, because I was trained in corporate finance. I started teaching international financial management in the early 1970s. It was a brand new subject. I found it was fascinating because it required that one understand the external markets and context, the logic as well as the practice. And that was fascinating for me. And I, through happenstance, came from Dartmouth to MIT. I was happily teaching at Dartmouth. I strongly preferred a small multidisciplinary school because that's the way I work. My wife could not stand the small town in the early 1970s. She came to Boston College Law School. I followed her. That's the way these decisions get made. At MIT, I was introduced to my mentor, Dick Robinson, who was building the international group. And at that time, international was largely thought of as regions and functions. And I was the token finance guy, and I knew Latin America. And so I helped complete the space because I knew an interesting location and I knew a function. And I continued that way for probably 7 or 8 years. I taught in finance, I did international finance, and I gradually moved over towards more general international management and global strategy. And I would argue John Stoppard, who I'd gotten to know in a visit at London Business School, was a key person who helped me move to global strategy, where place and firm strongly interact. And to me, international management has always been about the interaction of place and firm. I've always sought colleagues who were serious scholars about places, not just from places, but scholars about places and scholars about firms and interested in the interaction. Of course, you know, we in international management got a very good smell in the middle 80s because global strategy became hot. But note what happened. Places went away. It became a general discipline. It had nothing to do with places. And I think we lost a lot. The founders of international management, I would go back to my mentor, Dick Robinson. He was a xenophile. If it was different, it was worth studying. It was out there to study different places and understand what business was like in different places, as opposed to just a business function. And I think we've lost some of that fascination with difference. And of course, with globalization, there is less difference as well, but there's plenty out there. So that's really the story. Had I not been an international management prof, what would I have done? I would love to have been a diplomat. But I didn't go that way. I interviewed for the Foreign Service, but I went through B schools instead. I wish I had spent more time living abroad. It's ironic that as a university professor teaching international business, you're largely stuck in one place. So I've been stuck in Cambridge, Massachusetts for 50 years with 1, 2, 3, 4 one-year sabbaticals abroad. I wish that I had lived for a decade or more inside a place. It's so fascinating to go to a new place, try to understand its rules, try to rethink everything you know about how business interacts with society in a different place. And that for me remains the fascination. So that's the kind of the nutshell on how I got into it. In the process, I think I've always been interdisciplinary and focused, which for me means focus on an important topic. Think about a couple of useful ways of looking at it, ideally at least one way that you're very practiced at, one discipline, and one other discipline that has a high leverage on that phenomenon, because it will give you a different lens. And it's phenomenon driven. International business is about the firm. It's not about the economics of the firm or the sociology of the firm or the political science of the firm. It's about the firm and its interaction with place. Place has lots of disciplines, firms have lots of disciplines. The interaction between the two obviously is multiple disciplines. From that, I think I learned the multidisciplinary game. At MIT, one of the programs I'm proudest of is the energy minor that I helped design and found across all 5 schools of science, engineering, humanities and social science, management, and urban studies and architecture. This is a minor focus on energy problems, and the whole idea is MIT students tend to have very deep disciplinary training, and we wanted to give them an orthogonal, structured learning that was problem focused and required multiple modes of thinking. And that's the way I tend to think of IB, and it seemed to me this was the same game. And we divvied it up into science, technology, and social science. We built our various tiers. It still lasts. It was a great deal of fun. I also designed our executive MBA that has a very similar structure. And I do executive education with people from architecture and engineering and systems engineering. And despite my degree in Latin American studies, I even was named a professor of systems engineering. So that's about me.
For the sake of time, can we now switch gears towards research and expand on the forgotten variables or the underutilized, underemphasized variables, starting with, for example, geographies or places, like you mentioned. Okay, this is one of the things that IB is overlooking because maybe there's a evolution that IB has moved from a different perspective to the current one.
It's places, it's kind of logic of places versus logic of firms and the interaction of the two, because places are societies, our economies, our polities, right? They are physical places, and they have many explanations, and firms are part of that story. But the interesting thing about IB and multinational firms is they spill across places. So the fact that they span places is what both gives them their special juice, but they also have an impact on the places. They carry things from one to the other. They shape things. We have some of that in IB. Early on, there was a lot of research that looked at characteristics of countries and whether or not that led to a lot of foreign investment. There was never a very careful look about what kind of investment or how the firm interacted with the place. There still is very little of that kind of information because that typically requires looking. That often requires looking at the firm. It often requires looking at the impacts of the firm. I was just noticing a new article on kind of the SSRN site about multinational firms and foreign direct investment in innovation, kind of a controlled experiment about whether foreign direct investment liberalization in China in particular sectors and places leads to enhanced innovation by domestic firms. I see virtually no inquiry of that kind in IB. And yet that would be a very central issue. What happens when a firm moves across borders? Does it change? Do other firms change? Does the ecosystem change? What's the impact? So there's very little impact research. There's also very little process research. There's very little research on what the firm does and why and how it does it. We tend to do so many regressions on meaningless external variables. And I like to remind people, this is a field defined by a phenomenon. The phenomenon is a firm that stretches across borders. If you can't open the door and look inside the firm, I kind of question what's going on with the rest of it. There's some very good research. I mean, the field has matured a great deal. But I would like to see more real engagement with the phenomenon. And I would like to see more focus on, so what? What is different because of the presence of the multinational firm? Or what is different by a firm that was based and formed in an OECD country versus a firm that was based and formed in an emerging market versus a firm that has lost sight of where it was formed, if that's possible, right? What's different? Where did the differences come from? And how do place and firm interact? That's a loose answer, but I think it's very important. We're not a discipline, we're a field of study. we study a phenomenon. We study firms that are oxymoronic because they work across political economic systems. And as the world has become so much more disciplinary, then I think we need to embrace more disciplines. I was very pleased in the last decade by, substantially bringing in more economic geographers into IB. But I think we could do more, and we could say, regardless of your discipline, if you're about this phenomenon, this should be a place to join the conversation.
Sure. Well, we've got economic geography, we've got political science, international relations. Now, history is a big part of it.
Systems engineering, operations, logistics, I mean, you can go lots of different directions. And it's not a question of which discipline is right. It's almost like the old linguistic question, that if you're monolingual, you're not very bright. If you're bilingual, you have much more insight. Tri or quadrilingual doesn't add that much more, but it's bringing a couple perspectives to enhance your own and question your own, and also to be more open to someone else's. So the meeting place needs to be open to multiple interpretations, and what's common is the phenomenon.
I mean, for the sake of time, again, for the research segment, what is the next 5 to 10 years of the field? Where do you see the most bang for the buck come from?
Boy, that's really hard, because we have what's going on. The whole institutional field and the global rules of the game and the pecking order of places, of countries, is changing radically. So there could be a lot of research that deals with that. But there's another piece of research that technologies and kind of organizational logics of firms are also changing very rapidly. So on the one hand, we have multinational firms that are 100 years old. On the other hand, we have firms that are being born that are in brand new industries. So we simultaneously have very early in the life cycle and very late in the life cycle. We need to bring Ray Vernon back to write his third round of the product life cycle, which is the product life cycle in a world where that is populated by young and old firms in different industries. So that would be a big topic. For me, of course, I've always been interested in firms from what I think of as the G12, which is the G20 without the G8. So the middle countries. And what's happening with those firms, and especially what's happening with those firms when the US is no longer the only model. Because they can look to Europe, they can look to China, they can look to other places, they can look to the Middle East. What will they look like? Because we started this field in the 1950s and 60s. This was a US derivative field, and multinational firms were US derivative. They're not anymore. So those would be at least three big themes on the phenomenon. And then kind of the next level, I'd like to see much more on the interaction of places and firms, with more of the so what. What are the impacts? What are the differences? But a lot of people are trying at this, and then I would still like to see some process research where people worry about what management is like. I'd love to see a hypothesis that is actually tied to a question that a manager might ask. It matters, right? Ultimately, we're teaching people to be managers, and we're trying to give them frameworks that help them understand their world.
Interesting. Don, what was the best advice you received?
Best advice? The best advice I ever received, I was thinking of moving from Dartmouth to MIT, and I went and talked to my mentor at Dartmouth, really good man. And he said, Don, he said, the choice is, I said, should I stay at MIT or should I come back to Dartmouth? He said, the choice is easy. He said, you can stay at Dartmouth, you'll have a very good career, or you can stay at MIT, you'll be terrified every day of your life. There's no choice. That was the best advice. I tend to rise to the occasion of wherever I'm located. And it's nice to be with a set of hard driving, very interesting colleagues and demanding students. It makes you better.
Now I would like to get into the you giving advice, you being a mentor part of the conversation. What are the resources, capabilities that young scholars, assistant professors need to develop to be successful in the next phase of IB?
Again, given the way I've talked about the field, which I think is still phenomenon defined, but the way academia is going, which is being quite disciplinary and quite methodological, a young scholar is going to have to span that. So the young scholar is going to have to become quite knowledgeable about a particular type of phenomenon that ideally is an important one. And they also probably need a primary way of approaching that. As an economist, as a sociologist, as a political scientist, they probably need a primary set of methods to approach that. But they need some openness to a couple of the others. They can't be fully multidisciplinary. That's not credible for a young person. I look at myself. I was very lucky. I was trained in corporate finance, and that was a high prestige discipline at that point. I moved into this multidisciplinary problem domain, but to some extent, my reputation carried from finance. And I learned this in system engineering also. The young scholar needs to be able to get a warranty letter from a disciplinary faculty member. I know that when I came up for tenure, it was not an easy case. I know that a very important senior member of the faculty said, we're not proposing Don Lessard for tenure in finance, but we like the kind of problems he works on, and we like the way he works on them. If a scholar in an interdisciplinary field cannot get support from a disciplinary scholar along those lines, they're probably not going to make it. Their differentiation is the problems they work on and the way they work on them. So there's got to be some creativity and engagement with the problem. But you got to pay attention. Disciplines exist for a reason also. So you got to work, it's a matrix. It's a disciplinary versus problem matrix, and positioning yourself in it and being good enough at one of the dimensions and really outstanding on the other.
Interesting. I mean, the concepts that you're talking about are quite interesting. So do you see a difference between European scholars versus Americans versus the Asian scholars from, for example, China, Korea? Do you see a difference between their approaches?
Certainly, I think on the IB side, the Europeans have been probably more philosophical and more concerned about institutions. Got to remember that we in the US went through a 50-year period where we assumed that institutions were exogenous, because by and large they were. And there was relatively little interaction between institutions and the industrial structure, with our liberal order and the fact that we ran the world. And that was not true anywhere else. So that was kind of an exceptional period in America. The European scholars, I think, have worried more about the politics, more about the institutional structures, have thought not just about market strategy, but also about organization. They remember that labor and skills also matter. It's not just a financial market game. That's too generalizing, but I see that European. The Chinese, I think, face it's complicated because they have a brand new phenomenon, which is exciting. On the other hand, they are coming into this hyper-competitive period trying to publish in A journals and therefore trying to look like everyone else. So you have these dual pulls of a brand new phenomenon that is just fascinating, but a set of very, very hidebound rules about what research should look like. And, IB research right now, if I think of JIBS, pretty quantitative, but not very experimental, virtually no identification, and very little qualitative, deep looking at the phenomena. It's caught in the middle.
Interesting. What is one question that I should have asked you or given you, but I didn't? What is one thing that you need to get out?
I thought about that. There were various, but one I'd say is what comparative advantage within the university did I gain by being an IBer? And I think the advantage I gained was the ability to think about new interdisciplinary ways to address emerging phenomena. So I've gotten very involved with energy transition and kind of systemic change. But the ways you approach studying that are very similar to IB, and there are a lot of other problems. We're pretty good systematic problem-based thinkers. Multi-level, multi-theory, and that and I can talk to lots of colleagues around that. I now run programs on city level resilience and things like that. They're not IB, but it's the same structure. So I actually feel like there is a discipline in being multidisciplinary.
Interesting. Dan, thank you so much for your time. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. It was very interesting and very refreshing to hear these points.
Thank you for the conversation. Okay, bye-bye.